Welcome to Matt's Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier, and thank you kindly for stopping by. I'd like to thank Ramanyang for the interview yesterday at CCTV, which is being carried today, which is about Ghana reaching out to the IMF and dialing up Christine Lagarde. We took a selfie with my new Galaxy K Zoom, which was rather fun. I'll put up that photograph. And then later on, I had an interview with the BBC and Sophie Kenya, whom I knew from her time here before she went to the BBC, and I'm grateful to her for having me on her show. Of course, all the interest is in the US-Africa Summit, which I think was a tremendous success. We've put up 3 links, part 1, part 2, part 3, for the interviews that I did with Howard French, extremely erudite, sophisticated and interesting, and of course the author of China's Second Continent. And if you get a chance, do have a look at that. My home thoughts returned to my daughter. I got my first email from her, Hannah, and I told her it was a momentous moment for me and that from now on she had to send me an email every single day. Political reflections. I like this photograph of Palestinians relaxing on a beach in Gaza during the 72-hour ceasefire. I came across this quote from a play I'd seen many years ago, which is Aeschylus's Agamemnon, and in that Cassandra says, "This house stinks of blood-dripping slaughter." And indeed, that's the world as it is, from Ukraine to Syria to everywhere, Gaza. NATO fears ground invasion as Russia masses troops on Ukraine border. Russia has massed around 20,000 combat-ready troops on Ukraine's border and could use the pretext of a humanitarian mission to invade, NATO said on Wednesday. Its starkest warning yet that Moscow could soon mount a ground assault against its neighbor. Fighting escalating, rebels losing ground in the week since a Malaysian airliner was shot down over separatist-held territory. Russia has announced military exercises this week in the border region. We're not going to guess what's on Russia's mind, but we can see that we can see what Russia is doing on the ground, and that is of great concern. Russia has amassed 20,000 combat-ready troops on Ukraine's eastern border, NATO spokeswoman said. Moscow could use the pretext of a humanitarian or peacekeeping mission as an excuse to send troops into eastern Ukraine. This is the NATO spokesperson. The Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said on Wednesday the threat of a direct intervention by Russia's military in Ukraine has risen over the last couple of days, and you can see that the noise levels have been ratcheted higher. Interesting piece in Bloomberg as the military endgame in Ukraine approaches. President Vladimir Putin must decide just how far he's prepared to go to defend the pro-Russian insurgency. Ukrainian forces closing in on the remaining separatist strongholds in the eastern part of the country, military analysts say. The revolt sparked by Putin's annexation of Crimea in March is destined to fail without a sharp increase in aid from Russia. That means Putin must now decide whether to double down and risk further international isolation. Putin has a very difficult choice in front of him. He has to protect his position in Russia. He has to show that he's successfully pursuing his goals. He can't afford to look like a loser in the eyes of the people. This is what I found interesting. Putin has been so far able to deny controlling the separatists by pursuing a hybrid war that his predecessors have practiced on the fringes of Tsarist and Soviet empires for hundreds of years, according to James Scher. This model relies on informal networks of operatives and fighters and aims to erase the frontier between civil and interstate conflict. Its constituent parts are not only serving officers of Spetsnaz units and the Federal Security Service, but retired servicemen, deserters, the private security forces of oligarchs, Cossacks, Chechen fighters, adventurers, and criminals. Very valid point, I think. And then N.K. Badrakumar, I think, accurately reflects sort of the line of thinking amongst the BRICS, except he's Indian, of course. Why Obama's Russia sanctions are doomed. Obama doesn't get the point that the world is not interested in isolating Russia or in wrecking the Russian economy at a juncture when the world economy is in dire need of growth centers, especially outside the Western world. So if Europe wants only Russian gas, will ban Russian oil, that's fine with the fast-growing economies such as India or China or Vietnam. If Europe doesn't want to purchase Russian weapons anymore, that's also fine with India, Iraq, Egypt, Venezuela, Brazil, etc., which still have arms deals with Russia. Most certainly, BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization are not going to wither away. What Obama overlooks is that the instruments of the Cold War era have outlived their utility. It's plain arrogance on his part, and this is Badrakuma, to delude himself that he's something of a magical Pied Piper and the rest of the world simply follows him. Why should the world fight America's war to salvage the pristine status of the US dollar so as to preserve America's global hegemony, despite being a power inexorably in decline? The BRICS Bank, which is destined to rival the World Bank and the IMF, signifying the end of Western dominance of the global financial and economic order, to quote a prominent Indian strategic pundit who heads the National Security Council Advisory Board, is an immutable fact of life already. India, Brazil and China are not going to be frightened by the West's restrictions on Russian banks, which is a school of thought which I find myself agreeing with. I think it was an unnecessary fight to pick with Vladimir Putin, and really the US should concentrate on countering China, because that is a far more important competitor than Russia. Obama's Africa summit ends with China lead over US challenged. Obama's administration has sought to use the 3-day US-Africa Leaders Summit that ends in Washington today as a way to spur investment in a continent. I think it's been extremely successful, that holds some of the richest mineral deposits, fastest growing economies, and a burgeoning middle class. While China has stolen a march on the US with its trade with Africa surpassing $200 billion last year, more than double that of the US, contrasting investment styles mean American businesses have the potential to profit. Does America want to invest in infrastructure, in roads? Probably not, said Bob Collymore. I don't think there's a question of competing. This should have started much earlier, said President Paul Kagame in an interview in Washington yesterday. If things are done right, the relationship, the partnership between the US and Africa has the potential to bypass the relationship between Africa and Europe, also the relationship between Africa and China. There is a complementary role, Collymore said. We see American private investors coming into the country. We don't see Chinese private investors coming into the country. American companies are really losing out on opportunities to grow and to create jobs, both here and in Africa, as China is delving into Africa head first, said Michael Bloomberg. China's approach is a big bang, and I don't believe that Africa will transform because of a big bang, said Joshua Oigara. It will transform because of simultaneous many businesses, partnerships across different sectors. President Obama also said a new Africa is emerging, some of the world's fastest growing economies and a growing middle class, the youngest and fastest growing population on earth. Africa will help shape the world like never before, he said, adding, Africa's progress is being led by Africans. I'll put up a photograph of him delivering his opening remarks to more than 50 leaders gathered for the US-Africa Leaders Summit. I'll put up a photograph of Barack Obama arriving at dinner for the US-Africa Leaders Summit, and then another one of the First Lady and Laura Bush welcoming the delegation of African first spouses at the summit. And I'd like to thank Zainab Badawi of BBC Hard Talk for the shout out she gave me in the John Kerry interview on Hard Talk. That's the sort of thing that gets me excited, and I must say I'm grateful. I'll put up the link for the actual interview and also a link for the transcript. The question she posed, you do invest in Africa. Let me just tell you what Alykhansatchu, Chief Executive of Rich Management in Nairobi, said. Look at Kenya. America is already heavily invested. We issued a Eurobond in Kenya where we borrowed $2 billion. 66% of that was bought by North America. And just in that, you see that North America is putting the capital down, as you say, that Africa is then using to build infrastructure. The irony is that most of this stuff is being built by Chinese contractors and not the Americans. You're putting the investment in, but somebody else perhaps is benefited. Well, that's life. It also shows that we're not in it just to have our own contractors come over. We are doing this because we think it's the right thing for Africa, and indeed other countries and other companies will benefit. More power to them. Ultimately, this is good for Africa, and it's good for these countries to have the stability and the capacity as they build. We will all benefit from that on a global basis. There will be less Boko Harams, less Al-Shabaabs, there will be less cause for people to have their minds filled with extremist ideology rather than to engage in the broader benefits of society. And we're interested in that, and I'm glad we are as a country. Okay, just looking at this infrastructure point, Badawi asks, when you say that you're not just in it for construction projects and so on, and the Chinese, of course, have been doing a great deal of that, because now, of course, since 2009, they've overtaken the United States as the biggest single country to trade in total with Africa. It's now $200 billion in total trade. Trade, but not invest, Kerry answers. Yes, not investment. We are the biggest investor, Kerry says. Question, I accept that, but in terms of trade, China is way out there. Kerry asks, what does that tell you? That tells you something, doesn't it? The US is to spend $550 million on an African rapid response force. The United States doesn't have a desire to expand and create a big footprint inside of Africa, Obama said at a news conference. What we want to make sure is we can do is partner with the African Union, with individual countries to build their capacity. That remains a key component of the US's leverage over the continent. The euro is at 133.79 when I checked last, admittedly 2 hours ago. Dollar index 81.50, Japanese yen 102.28, Swiss franc 0.9081, the pound 168.41, the Aussie 0.9271, Indian rupee 61.42, South Korean won 1037.20, the Rial at 227.37, Egyptian pound 715.04, South African rand 1075.94. The dollar index is at 81.50. I'll put up a 3-month chart, but it feels like to me as if it wants to push on. Euro dollar 133.79, under pressure here at November lows. Nestle, the world's largest food company, plans to spend 8 billion Swiss francs in its first share buyback in 3 years after reporting first half revenue growth that exceeded analysts' estimates. Revenue gained 4.7%, excluding acquisitions, divestments, and currency shifts. This compares with a 4.5% median expectation. We've had a few disappointments in the food industry lately, but Nestle has managed to report numbers that are slightly better than expected, doing better than Danone and Unilever. Organic sales growth in the Asia, Oceania, and Africa zone was 4.7% compared with analysts' estimates for a 5.7% gain. Gold back above 1300. I'll put up a 1-year chart, 1306.225. Crude oil 96.86. Last, I'll put up a 6-month chart. Barry Malone, who I follow on Twitter, posted an infographic. Africa's biggest trading partner, China. Biggest donor, US. Biggest investor, Great Britain. Paul Kagame, in an interview with Bloomberg, said, we might go for double, that or more, up to $1 billion. Rwanda plans to sell its second international bond of as much as $1 billion next year to fund the construction of an airport and power plants. I want to build on the success of their $400 million bond, which was issued in April 2013. That was more than 8 times oversubscribed. Yields on Rwanda's Eurobond due May 2023 have dropped 142 basis points to 6.06%. And we're going to see a lot more issuance. And this is the comment I liked. The markets are never wrong, Paul Kagame said. Look at the situation in Rwanda, where we have been 20 years ago and where we are now. It's short of miraculous. It can't be just because we are violating human rights. It's because actually we value and respect human rights The president was a guest of mine at Mindspeak in Kigali in 2011, and I posted a photograph of him and myself, and I captioned it that day, "There is nothing like a dream to create the future." I'll put up a photograph of Paul Kagame found on Bloomberg, and another photograph of Paul Kagame and his daughter Angie Kagame arriving at the White House for a state dinner. She was actually sitting behind us at the Mindspeak session in 2011, but she's grown incredibly tall. South African all-share down 0.5% yesterday, up 10.452% this year. Dollar rand softening up at 10.7596, going back towards the bottom of the trading range. MTN said first half profit increased. Data revenue was up 39%, and in that number you see the arrival of the information century. The Egyptian pound 715.03. Egyptian stock market has surged another 0.41%. It's up 33.39% this year, in Africa's best. The Nigeria all share was up a marginal 0.11% yesterday. It's up 2.443% this year. Boko Haram is accused of unleashing a new weapon of war, the female suicide bomber. This is BBC. 4 of them, all teenage girls, carried out attacks in the biggest northern city of Kano last week, leading to social media sites going viral with speculation, dismissed as unfounded by the government, that Boko Haram had turned some of the more than 200 schoolgirls abducted in April into human bombs. Nigeria's first female bomber, a middle-aged woman, struck in June, riding a motorcycle. She went to a military barracks in the northeastern city of Gombe, where she detonated her explosives while being searched at a checkpoint, killing 1 soldier. To use female suicide bombers is the most dramatic strategy that an organization can use. It becomes easier to penetrate targets because we are less suspicious about women. The military alleges that Hafsat Usman Bako is a recruiting sergeant for Boko Haram. I'll put up the photograph. I'll also put up a photograph of a petrol station which was targeted in Kano City by a woman last week. Ghana Stock Exchange edged 0.29% lower. It's up 6.2004% in 2014, but they've now asked the IMF for help. The Ghana president, I'm going to put up a photograph of him and his wife, which I found from M&G Africa, as they went to the White House for dinner. The Ghanaian President Mahama said his government is open to receiving loans from the IMF as it turns to the lender for help in rescuing a currency crisis. "We are not looking for a bailout," he said in an interview. "It is more along a discussion and a program that we're looking at. If it comes with money, that is fine." Coca-Cola and its African bottling partners announced a new investment of $5 billion during the US Africa Leaders Summit. That investment is to be made over the next 6 years. In Africa, hair care becomes a multi-billion-dollar industry. This is a report on Reuters. And it's very, very interesting, talking about how L'Oreal, Unilever are all trying to address this market. Talking about some estimates put Africa's dry hair industry at as much as $6 billion a year. Very interesting article. If you've got time, have a look at it. We did a Mindspeak with Patricia Itau, who was then the MD of L'Oreal before she resigned. I'll put up a photograph of that and also a link to her Mindspeak, because it's very interesting. She did a lot while she was there. She also acquired a local company. I like this photograph of the President Pierre Nkurunziza of Burundi and his wife. There's another photograph of the Republic of Congo, the President Denis Sassou meeting with Obama and Michelle Obama. Here in Kenya, the President Uhuru Kenyatta, I'll put up the photograph of him being very graciously welcomed by Barack and Michelle Obama. And as I said on the 4th of August in my article, with respect to ourselves, I sincerely wish we reset our relations. And I think photographs from the White House yesterday showed President Kenyatta being graciously received, and I think it's an important signal in the noise. Signals a resetting of relations, which have been suboptimal for a while. Kenya's bond with the US is unbreakable, Uhuru Kenyatta said. "I want to reassure you concerning a rumor going around the international public sphere that Kenya and my government have turned away from the West in favor of the East. He said Kenya's trade deals with countries from the East has not changed in any way the historic bonds it has with the US and other nations. He's saying Kenya's economy was getting more sophisticated and such maturity was naturally driving the country to extend itself globally, including exploring opportunities in the East to complement its existing partnerships. He emphasized that Kenya's bonds with the US are born of shared values and would not be broken easily. These values impelled our independence movements to partner with the United States to secure the ideal of freedom from colonialism, racism, exploitation, and exclusion, and to pursue the principles of democracy, human rights, and free enterprise. He said there should be no anxiety about Kenya's relationship with the US, which he described as eternal. Every time Kenya and the US have collaborated on any project, the world has witnessed spectacular success, he said. The President told US investors to view Kenya as the destination of choice for their business, talked about the Eurobond, encouraged American firms to take advantage of Kenya's strategic location as the economic powerhouse of the Eastern and Central Africa region, talked about the EAC, common market, mining and petroleum, and say that we're dealing with security threats. Kenya is involved in anti-terrorism cooperation with many regional and international partners. Among our stalwart allies in these efforts is the United States. Safaricom is reporting that it expects its joint acquisition of rival U-Mobile to be completed within months at a cost of about $120 million. The Nairobi All Share closed at a fresh record yesterday, jumping another 0.83%. It's up 14.65% this year, but today there's been some profit-taking pressure. NAC 20 closed above the 5,000 mark for the second day. This is the second close above 5,000, and that is the first time it's been above this level since the 29th of January. I think interest rates are headed low. I think the market is in a bull phase, notwithstanding today's profit-taking. Safaricom was very strong yesterday, a little bit of profit-taking today. Scan Group will report half-year results tomorrow, eased 0.5% to close at 46.75. KCB has been on one big roll, but is suffering some profit-taking today. Edged 0.85% lower yesterday. It's going to close lower today, but remember it's had a phenomenal run higher. As of this morning, it was plus 22.75% this year. Centum unchanged at a record 49.25. That's rallied nearly 50% this year. CIC was strong, up 4.2944% yesterday. Britam as well. EABL are reporting results after the market closes today, rallied 1.95% yesterday. And Samir has been on a losing streak since issuing a profits warning. Once again, I do appreciate the fact that you take time to stop by. I am deeply grateful for that. Thank you.